Hello everyone, welcome back into the studio. My name is Eirik, and today we're going to continue with our reclining figure from a few weeks back. We're working on the small scale of around 1/6 scale in oil-based clay, and from reference that we've collected and copied from the drawings of master painter Tintoretto, who used a lost Michelangelo maquette to come up with this composition supposedly. Before we dive headfirst into the rendering or modeling of the surface of this sculpture, we need to complete the blocking to a satisfactory degree. I don't always find this necessary, and sometimes I'm a little lazy and render sections before the hole has been blocked in. This is not really good practice, but depending on the complexity of the figure, sometimes it's okay. I'm going to be using the other arm as reference for the second arm, the left arm, as this arm is already established and sitting there waiting to be measured. The first arm was of course compared to the body itself, which was established before the arms naturally, and this leads to the arm functioning with the body if we do our job correctly. In a regular standing T-pose, the elbow reaches down to about the bottom of the ribcage. Most poses you're going to want to sculpt is not going to have this be so convenient for you, simply because the arm is not going to be in a T-pose, or the body rather is not going to be in a T-pose. Depending on the pose, the elbow can fall in many places in relation to the bottom of the ribcage, of course. However, it is useful to know that in a T-pose, the elbow falls at the bottom of the ribcage. You have to cross-check several things when blocking in the arms, so having a few useful measurements to double-check is good practice. For example, the length of the upper arm from top of the shoulder to the elbow corresponds roughly with the width of the shoulders. This length is then the same as the elbow to the knuckles of the hand. The more comparative measurements you can find and use, the greater the chance you'll have of getting the proportions of the arms or any other part of the body for that matter correct. Speaking of the rake tool, here it comes. There's going to be quite a lot of it in this video, so we're going to get to talk about it. For me, the block-in is to some extent concluded at this point, with a few exceptions, and thus it's time to bring the surface together and head towards essentially what is a finished sculpture. This is a lengthy process usually, and the greater the scale, the more we can explore during this phase of the work. Most of the time I find there are many adjustments to be made as I continue down this path. We're going to start raking around the outline of the figure, mostly the outline that's towards the sky or facing up, as this outline will have a greater visual impact right off the bat. The outline of the figure as it contacts the ground is equally as important for when viewers get closer to the work and they study the work, but the immediate impact for viewers comes from the outline that's facing up because it has much greater contrast compared to the outline facing down into the base where we have sort of clay against clay color. The outline is raked, and ideally any lumps and bumps that break the continuity of the outline is resolved with this step. The outline should feel like a smooth pencil line, and ideally I'd say without too many sudden breaks. Most of the time, a sudden break is going to have an intermediary, a line that connects the sudden break in a more pleasant way and gives the impression of a continuous line that flows along the outline of the figure. When working from life or from more concrete reference, the outline is the only place where we can easily observe the depth of transition between individual forms. This makes it very important as we need to have it resolved to a certain extent to fully grasp what happens inside the outline of the figure. There is no easy way to observe depth unless that depth happens in the outline of the figure itself. We can't really observe the depth between the ribs, for example, but if those depths appear in the outline or in the contour of the figure, then that can give us a good idea of what's going on. I'm using a small rake tool with fine teeth in this video. The teeth of the rake that I'm using and the rakes that I prefer to use are lower and more shallow and therefore don't cut too deeply. They are also spaced apart a little bit, and I prefer this in my rake tools as opposed to deeper teeth. Deeper teeth are more aggressive and remove more clay, leaving you with a rougher surface. I have rake tools like that for certain instances where major changes need to occur, but usually my rakes are used more as a modeling and finishing tool rather than a tool used during major changes. I have a variety of sizes that really help me achieve a very similar result no matter the scale that I'm working on. This tool that I'm using here in this video is from Sculpture House, and I have the same tool in 3 different sizes, this being the smallest of the 3. Sometimes if I need to deal with softer clay or an area of softer detail, I'll use a guitar string rake. which is essentially a tool where the rake part is made up of some sort of guitar or bass string, and not hard wire. These work well since there's a little bit of give in the guitar string, it's soft, but the firmer clays doesn't really play well with these kinds of tools because these tools don't really like to bite into the firm clays. They're best used for faces and smaller forms, things like ears, when using water-based clay, which is softer than the oil-based clay I'm using here. Especially concave forms are nice with a guitar string rake. Another big part of this step, cleaning up the surface and dealing with the finished modeling of the surface, is to fill holes left behind by the block-it. This is a typical mistake that happens to students where they'll use the rake tool and they'll rake through the surface to remove blemishes and holes. And in doing so, they remove too much clay and flatten out the surface of their sculptures. So instead of raking down the surface to remove holes, we're going to fill them with some clay. The oil-based clay is heated under a little heat lamp next to me. The clay of the sculpture is of course cooled off by the time the new clay gets on it, so it's fairly cold and fairly hard. And this, I think, is a nice feature as the soft clay that I'm adding simply squishes into the holes of the surface without enough force on my part needing to be exerted to push the clay that's already on there around. The oil-based clay being heated up provides this feature. We're going to be quite generous with the amount of clay used here because, as we discussed, one of the big problems most of us have with our work is that it's simply too harsh and sharp in the transitions. So knowing this, we can be brave and add a little bit of extra clay here, knowing that we're likely only going to be combating our own bad habits, leaving us with a better looking sculpture hopefully. When adding clay, it's usually into holes that have formed between pieces of clay added to represent form. This means most of the holes exist between the forms, and that's where we're going to have our transition, of course. You will be very surprised by the amount of clay you need to add into a transition before forms on either side disappear. It's going to take a lot of clay before something happens to that transition and the forms around it. Lots of clay will need to be added before we simply lose two forms and they transition and end up with one big form. Here are some rules to consider when dealing with transitions. Transitions should be easy to contend with if our block-in has accommodated them taking place. A few things need to take place for that to be the case, of course. There needs to be a decent amount of depth in between the forms that have been established. If all the forms exist on a flat surface, sort of as bumps, we're going to have a hard time transitioning them into one another. But if there is depth between the forms, for example, as seen here from the side view of Michelangelo's Apollo, there's depth between the oblique and the abdomen. If that's the case, then the transition is pretty easy. Here's another example from the torso area of the body seen as a horizontal cross-section from the book Anatomy for Sculptors, which I recommend to have for everyone. It's a great anatomy book for sculptors. Notice in particular that the body is not round with bumps on it here. It's not shaped as a barrel. It's quite a complex shape when we get a cross-section. And we need to make sure we capture this aspect of the body for transitions to have the best chance at success. This means that issues with transitions often originate in the drawing of the sculpture itself. Drawing just meaning where something is placed in relation to something else. And there are places where there is a lot less depth, and these are often overlooked and missed by beginning sculptors. A typical one that is strangely missed is the depth between the front of the ribcage and the armpit. Without this depth clearly established, the entire front plane of the ribcage and the shoulders becomes excessively flat and boring. The lower back is another one where the depths are smaller and the light, usually coming from above in a standing pose at least, washes out this area and makes it difficult to observe. Keep in mind that without depth between forms, transitions are going to be hard, so try to get some depth even when it's hard to see and even when you think there is none. You can always reduce the depth between the forms, it's very easy to do, but it's very hard to dig it out later. Almost impossible to do a good job digging it out later, frankly. The volume of each form is another thing that's often missed. Each form needs a certain amount of volume, otherwise the transition simply connects two flat pieces of clay, and the entire thing then of course becomes flat. By forcing a transition between two forms lacking in volume, you'll get one of two results. Your sculpture becomes flat and therefore looks heavier than the reference and, quite frankly, a little bit boring. Or you manage to force the transition and the sculpture becomes too harsh. The transitions become too harsh and now the sculpture looks like it's too thin or too tense. Each form on either side of a transition needs a certain amount of volume in order for those forms to survive the addition of the clay into the transition. If there is depth between the forms and there is enough volume, then the transition should happen without barely any work. It should almost be simple, frankly.
Thank you for watching until the end of the video. If you want to see more from me, check out my Patreon page linked in the description below. Until next time, stay creative.